Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. We've reached part 3 in our series with Dominic Dromgoole about revolutionary first days and first nights in Paris. And we're going to be talking about another truly legendary occasion. Does it deserve the legend? Yes, it does. We're in 1913, and we're going to be talking about the first performance of the Rite of Spring, composed by Stravinsky, staged by Diaghilev, danced by Nijinsky. Dominic was back in New York and back in a hotel room for this one, so apologies again that the quality of the sound is a little bit tinnier than normal. Do stick with it. Dominic, the event, the explosive premiere that we're talking about today, is an incredibly Russian production. It's Diaghilev producing it, it's Stravinsky writing it, it's Nijinsky dancing it, it's Roerich designing the set, it's the Ballet Russe, it's Russia. But we're in Paris again. It happens in Paris again. 1913, did you just have to do it in Paris if you wanted to make a big splash in the art world? Russia had to be in Paris to remind the world about Russia?
I think that's true. Russia was a sort of centre of culture and it was a centre of modernity. I think we in the UK massively overestimate our own importance and our own magnetism in the 19th century and the early 20th century. And we like to think that we were the centre of the world because we had an empire. We weren't culturally. If you read any of the great Russian authors, Tolstoy, Chekhov, they're always dropping in phrases in French. They're always talking about trips to Paris or trips to the south of France. That's where the sort of gravitational pull was. If you went east all the way to Russia, or if you went west all the way to America, people didn't fantasize about bohemian trips to London. They fantasized about Paris. So it had that centrality. It was very important to Diaghilev, because Diaghilev was a great understander ahead of his time of the event. A lot of people had understood and written about and thought about the complete work of art, but it was always the complete work of art that encompassed, Wagner wrote about it as the thing that pulled together music and movement and myth and acting and lighting and everything within a room. What Diaghilev understood was that the event wasn't within a room. The event was in the world and in society. And what he was always after was to create explosive moments, extraordinary happenings that then rippled out through the city they were in, beyond the city they were in, through journals and newspapers and chitter-chatter, into the country they were in, and then beyond the country they were in, into the world through academic discussion and through the obsession and fascination of artists and anyone interested in art. There was what Durkheim called l'effervescence sociale, the whole world coming to be thrilled by something. And the chance of having that sort of event was much higher in Paris than it was anywhere else, certainly in Petersburg.
And he certainly succeeded. So the event that we're talking about now, the premiere of the Rite of Spring, it is one of the legendary. Effervescence sociale doesn't really capture it. It was an explosion. But one of the puzzles for me is trying to understand why this one was different than the other productions that the Ballet Russe had done with Stravinsky in Paris. They'd had a run of successes, the Firebird, Petrushka, and those had been events too. They'd been critical acclaim. People had shown out to see them, a lot of talk. This one is different. It's categorically different for the reasons that we're going to talk about. And it's not just in historical memory. People at the time realized something had gone very differently and very wrong in this case. But what was the difference? So one of the things that happened here is it was in a new theatre, as I understand it. So it was in the Théâtre Champs-Élysées that had been created by a Jewish impresario, a man called Astruc, who I think was the son of the Grand Rabbi of Belgium, I read somewhere. If anti-Semitism is going to be a part of this story, that's where the focus is going to be. Is it that this production was in this new theatre?
Yes, it is. I'll try and come on to the anti-Semitism in a moment. But just to answer the first bit of your question, which is how was this different? In what way was it different? The Ballet Russe had been, as you say, a sort of storming success and part of a continuing presentation of Russianness by Diaghilev, first with a great exhibition of Russian art, then with 2 seasons of opera, which sort of broke the mold and got huge praise. Then, when the opera appeared to be too expensive, they created the Ballet Russe company, and basically Diaghilev went back to Russia, stole an entire ballet company from the Imperial Theatre there and brought them back and created this new entity in Paris. And they had, as you say, success after success. So what was different? The star of their early successes was Nijinsky, but crucially, he wasn't the choreographer. The choreographer was Fokine, who was a little bit of a classicist, a little bit sensible, and a little bit of a grown-up. Diaghilev and Nijinsky were lovers and were very close, and Nijinsky, even though he was sort of rocketed through to success by this choreographer, Fokine, was sort of suspicious of him. He thought he had a slightly soft centre, that it was all a bit marshmallow at its heart, that it was all a bit old-fashioned and graceful and tutu-ish and over-candied and overly gentle. And Nijinsky wanted to do something wilder and stranger. And so Diaghilev, who could be brutal with collaborators, dropped Fokine. And in some way, Fokine had linked them back to the tradition of ballet, but also tempered and calmed their sort of wilder excesses. So the loss of him would be a big thing. And then Nijinsky took over as choreographer. Now, Nijinsky as a choreographer was sort of a genius and sort of bonkers. He choreographed one piece called Les Jeux, which was supposed to be about tennis, but it had 3 dancers charging around with tennis rackets, and the balls that were used were footballs, and all of the movements were based on golf. And it wasn't because he was doing something sort of smart, it was because he just didn't understand sport at all, and he just found it all a bit strange. He also did another one shortly before they did Rite of Spring, which, climaxed with a dancer sort of having a mock petit mort all over a scarf of a fawn. And he was pushing the envelope very hard, very fast. And bonkers is a cruel word to say, because he was actually borderline schizophrenic. And no one was pulling him back. No one was saying, calm down, or don't go too far, or don't go too wild. Diaghilev, if anything, was the opposite, because Diaghilev had this taste for, as I say, the event and for craziness and for doing things that were sort of out of control. He sort of loved it in some way. His great command to all collaborators was, étonne-moi, astonish me. And he'd say that to designers or choreographers or anyone he was working with, étonne-moi. And I'm not sure he had any real consistent aesthetics or ideas or morals beyond that. It was simply just be amazing. Amaze me in the morning. That was, his credo. So I think that's a crucial thing about why it was different. And then the other big different elements in my estimation were the venue, which is a fantastic theatre. It's a beautiful theatre, beautiful early signs of Art Deco. It's sort of too early for Art Deco, but it's sort of pushing that way with its elegance. And it's a fantastic venue for music. But, and this is crucial, it was new. And a new venue is very hard to make bold theatre in, because if you get into a new car, you smell that sort of funny emptiness and newness, and you feel a bit sort of uneasy in your own body while you're sitting in it for 2,000 or 3,000 miles. It's the same with the theatre. Theatres need damage, bruising, scarring, scuffing to acquire the authority to tell stories. If you try to tell any story in a new theatre, it's tough. If you try and tell a very bold story in a new theatre, which hasn't really found its own ghosts or its own emotional shape or its own personality, it's very easy for that story to look without foundations, a bit skittish, a bit fragile, a bit brittle. And that was the case. And then to get on to the anti-Semitism, yes. I think we all think of the Dreyfus scandal as a isolated incident that happened and then went away. That's very far from the case, as I'm sure you know. The Dreyfus scandal was a sort of poison that landed at the very, very end of the 19th century and never went away. Some people would say it didn't go away for 50, 60 years, and it opened up fissures in French and European society that took a long, long time to heal. And the amount of anti-Semitism was virulent and sort of scary. And people went after this rather benevolent, sweet fan of an entrepreneur, Gabriel Astruc, who built the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées really because he just loved the form and he loved music and he loved dance and he just wanted to be involved with these extraordinary mythic figures who were around Paris. But the opposition against him in the press, a lot of which was virulently anti-Semitic. When you read it, it's sort of toxic and vicious and unpleasant. And there was no doubt a certain amount of that in the audience as well.
And there's one other difference too, which is the costumes and the design. This guy, Nicolas Roerich, the previous Ballet Russe, and I only know this, I should say, because it was a question on University Challenge last night. They had a series of designs by Leon Bakst, and they were from Petrushka and the Firebird and the great Stravinsky, Nijinsky successes. And these costumes, and I have to say, I was watching it with my wife and son, and we started guessing the Rite of Spring, but we knew it couldn't be right because these were these gorgeous, elegant, sort of balletic-looking costumes. And, of course, these were the costumes of the great successful productions that preceded the Rite of Spring. It had a very different designer, this guy, Roerich. We'll talk a bit more about him later. But the designs were very different too, weren't they? They were sort of rustic, Slavic, shocking, deliberately non-beautiful. He de-beautified the whole enterprise.
He genuinely is bonkers. The thing about Roerich is that he tapped into a vein of sentimentality whereby he might have thought it was beautiful. He and Stravinsky, to some degree, might have thought it was beautiful. There's something strange about Central Russian culture, which they're madly sentimental about and nostalgic about, and is at the heart of their ideas of folk and folk art, some of which is creditable, some of which is a bit sinister. The strange thing about it is no one has ever colonized it or sentimentalized it in their imaginations. No other country has. No one, you don't see anyone aping Central Russian folk culture in the way that you do with South American folk culture, or you do with African folk culture, or you do with South Asian or Southeast Asian. There's something sort of untouchable about it and sort of odd, which everyone else steers clear of. So although to us it all looks quite peculiar, to the Russians themselves, they might think it was fantastic.
But they were in Paris, so, even they must have realised that in Paris it was a hard sell.
I don't think they knew quite what a hard sell it was going to be until the curtain went up and the audience reacted probably first with shock and then just with horrible derision and rudeness. It's hard to describe what it was like. It's based, as I say, on an antique idea of what people in Central Russia wore. The guys had sort of funny tea cozies on their head, floating uncertainly on top of big wigs, which looked like they were made of sort of Brillo pads. The women had a strange sort of makeup, which looked something like sort of war paint. The chaps are wearing garters that look like sort of Malvolio in the most expressionist production of Twelfth Night. The ladies are strapped across themselves in ways that can only be described as extremely unflattering. When it appeared, the audience just, as I say, they first shocked and then they just started hooting. And it was that derision and laughter that cascaded the whole evening into something out of control.
We've talked about a production, Au Beauvoir, which, in part at least, was designed to outrage. And it didn't come as a surprise to its creator that it produced the effect that it did. But with this one, from what you say and from what I've read about it, they didn't see it coming. And yet it's very different from their earlier productions. We haven't talked yet about the music, but in all respects, it went further than anything that they'd done before. It was incredibly technically difficult to put on. It had been rehearsed, but maybe not to a degree that allowed them to have real confidence in it. I mean, did Stravinsky himself have a sense of what he was about to unleash and what maybe might be about to go wrong?
I think Stravinsky did. And I think that they knew that it was a funny blend of invadingly modern. The music was in its pushing aside of melody and harmony and in its real bedrock reliance on rhythm and pounding rhythms and rhythms piled on top of each other in jarring and shocking and dissonant ways. I think Stravinsky knew that he was doing something sort of beyond the pale. I think they knew that the world of the play would be shocking to its Paris audience. I think Nijinsky knew that he was pushing aside the elegance, the sort of Olympian reach of conventional ballet, which was always sort of stretching upwards in gracious ways towards the heavens and full of elegant lines and beautiful curves and rules of composition and framing. And Nijinsky was doing something jerky, imploding, inward looking, thumping down into the earth, rooting itself downwards rather than upwards. So they knew they were breaking all those rules. But I think at the same time that in some ways they were reaching back to something ancient, but not an ancient that Western Europe knew. They were reaching back to the old patterns of the culture they came from. Stravinsky grew up around village singers, folk singers in Russia, who loved to do this funny thing of all singing on top of each other, piling their rhythms on top of each other in a sort of cacophonous wail that had its own logic. And in some ways, he was reflecting that in his own music. Roerich thought he was reviving traditional folk costume, but probably in a way that was exaggerated and sentimentalized. Nijinsky was he thought, reflecting something sort of ancient. You couldn't say it was under-rehearsed. It was incredibly heavily rehearsed because it had to be, because it was so new. And there was an unprecedented number of rehearsals for the musicians because they had to learn a whole new language of music. Stravinsky had rewritten how you make things, how you make a tune, and he got away with all the conventional things about slow building and diminuendo, and it was all jagged and violent and sudden. So they had to rehearse that very intensely, and the musicians were rehearsed almost into the floor. So in fact, in some bizarre way, they were intensely well prepared, and they needed to be, because when the curtain went up, or when the bassoon started playing its first notes before the curtain went up, the storm of noise and derision and attack that came at them meant that they had to be pretty well rehearsed and consistent in what they were doing just to survive it.
The night itself, it's 29th of May, 1913, so it's almost exactly 50 years after the opening of the Salon des Refusés, same month, 50 years later. Don't know if it was hot. Do we know if it was hot? It was one of the questions I'm curious about these things.
Unbelievably hot night. A very, very, very hot night, and a sort of stuffily hot night.
And the audience, what do we know about the audience? Because there's jeering, there's catcalling, but there's also, in the end, punches are thrown and the audience turns on itself. There's no such thing as the audience here. It's made up of lots of different groups. Can you describe the theatre and the kind of people who were there? And were they divided into clearly demarcated groups? Were there the sort of posh crowd and the bohemian crowd and the troublemakers?
That's the central thing, is the division. That's what made it such an electric night and such an explosive night. And in part, it was deliberate. When I was young, I went to a football match at QPR, in the old days of standing on terraces. And we were all at the QPR end. And, you had the whole crowd singing QPR, QPR, QPR. And you thought, oh, this is great. I was 10, 11, I can't remember what. And it was all, tribal and fun and exciting. And then I was down at the front of the QPR end. And then I heard from behind me, where all the noise had been QPR, 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 a huge contingent singing Arsenal, Arsenal, Arsenal. And what had happened is the Arsenal fans had got in with the QPR fans, and the rest of the match was just terror, because you'd hear them rumbling and they'd charge towards each other, there'd be punch-ups, you'd hear the crowd swelling towards you, you'd keep upright, and if you kept upright, you were sort of crushed against all the people around you, and if you fell over, which I did once, you were terrified of being trampled on. So the ultimate football nightmare was always two sets of fans in the same place. That is what happened at the Rite of Spring. And it was deliberately created and designed by Diaghilev, who was smart and knew that aggro helps noise, and that violence, creates its own energy and creates its own sensations. So he invited all of his bohemian crowd. He made sure that the ticket price was okay for all his bohemian crowd, for all of the artists, painters, musicians of Paris at that moment to be there. And in the gallery, what we'd call the dress circle, there were three separate spaces. There were a set of loges at the front of the gallery, And then there were a set of loges at the back of the gallery, high ticket prices, full of people wearing top hats, diamonds, pearls, very grand, very conservative, very traditional. But then there was a space in between those two lines of loges where people could stand and could walk freely. And Diaghilev deliberately filled those spaces up with bohemians and radicals and long-haired people who were hanging around Paris at the time. And they, the roll call of people who were there or who claimed to be there, because probably more people claimed to be there than were actually there, is like the roll call of modernism. It's Picasso and Delius and Gertrude Stein and Jean Cocteau and Gabriele D'Annunzio and, everyone claimed to have been there that night. No doubt a lot of them were. But so then you had friction, and you had friction at great proximity. And so before the show, these people had been snarling at each other and looking aggressive at each other and raising the temperature. And so it didn't take long for the show to begin and for a small amount of derision to come from the conservative traditionalists. And then that was met by shushing and aggro from the radicals. And then the whole thing went very, very swiftly downhill from there. One of the double bass players recalled a radical going along the loges, pushing the top hats of the posh down onto their heads and sort of over their ears, and of the more traditional and conservative element brandishing their canes. But it was very much about France against itself and the sort of fissures and tensions within French society all playing out in a very overheated crucible.
But given what they'd all put into the production itself, did Diaghilev not suspect that this might take away from people's focus on the music and the art? I understand why he wanted an event, but setting it up like that does make it, not just with hindsight, it does make it look like the event is going to be the fight in the audience. The event is going to be people having top hats pulled down over their heads. And it's going to be almost impossible under those circumstances to put on a complicated, demanding, novel production. And it's going to be hell for the people on the stage. Was that just collateral damage? It seems almost not just quixotic, but self-defeating.
I think you've got four very different characters at the heart of it and different approaches to art. I think for Diaghilev, it was collateral damage.
I mean, the show had to go on. He didn't want the thing to break down in an actual riot, did he?
He didn't want it to break down that riot. He wanted it to get to the end. It was brutal for the dancers, who were treated, appallingly. And it was a traumatic incident. I mean, they had the company of each other and the sort of shared sense of enduring a storm together to succor them. But it was pretty traumatizing as an experience. And at the end of the evening, Diaghilev said, exactly as I wanted. I mean, he thought that went perfectly well because it created the right amount of noise and the right amount of drama. There are people like that. There are always people like that near theatre, near art, people who you sort of wonder whether they have any passion or concern about what the art is, what it does, how it changes things, what it does to people. And you're sort of skeptical about that quite often. And you think these people really, what they love most of all is noise and heat and attracting heat and being in the center of the storm. That's a very big part of modern culture. And Diaghilev was probably the first great orchestrator of it. And so in a sense, he was a torchbearer, but a torchbearer of something that I've always found a bit,
And yet this one is so different from the productions that had preceded it. After all, he had been an incredibly successful impresario, doing stuff that was new and different, but doing it successfully. And this is a break. I mean, we'll talk about the ways in which it's gone down in history as a break in all sorts of ways. But for him personally, there's something very different about engineering this kind of event.
I think he'd always liked sort of shock, and he'd always understood the nature of shock. And part of the game of Snakes and Ladders, which he orchestrated with his company and with his collaborators, was about who is going to provide shock. So Stravinsky was pushed ahead of the other people who'd worked with him, like Debussy, because he was going to shock the most. Nijinsky was promoted and Fokine was demoted because the shock element would be there. Roerich, I think he probably realised, was just going to be beyond the pale for any Western sensibility. So he sort of knew what he was up to. But then, the other artists were not all like that. I mean, I think Nijinsky, even though what he was attempting was really extraordinary, was a genuine mold breaker and a genuine pathfinder in trying to find new ways for people to express themselves physically on stage and to speak about what it was to be human. And his sort of revulsion at the prettiness and the chocolate boxiness of the ballet world around him and his pushback against that, I think, came from a very genuine artistic impulse and fire within himself. Stravinsky is, no doubt an extraordinary genius and unbelievably bold and an incredible way of breaking with tradition while understanding what is at the heart of that tradition, but was at the same time a little bit of a tart and spent his life going further west, wherever the greatest degree of comfort and success and esteem and praise could be found. So he went from Russia to Paris, he went from Paris to New York, he went from New York to Los Angeles. And it was always in search of the sort of cushy ride to a degree.
And how is he on the night? Because it's his music that no one can hear. I mean, it's different, I would have thought, watching this thing from the wings, having sweated blood to write it, and to hear it drowned out with jeering and catcalls than engineering an event.
He started in the audience and he lasted 5 minutes of only 30 minutes. The show is 2 sort of 15-minute halves. He lasted 5 minutes in the audience, but then by that stage, the catcalling had got too much for him and he had to make an exit. But unfortunately, he was in the middle of a row. So he had to do one of those really uncomfortable sort of slow shuffles past people's outstretched legs and handbags, simultaneously trying to be indignant, like, oh, you're all Philistines, you don't understand me. And to be polite, like, excuse me, can I get by? Excuse me. Oh, I hate you all, I hate you all. Then he pushed his way out, he charged round backstage, at which point he had to almost rugby tackle Nijinsky, who was trying to get on stage to make a scene. But Nijinsky, as you know, wasn't dancing in it, he was only the choreographer. So he got hold of him by his dressing gown and pulled him back in the wings. And then Nijinsky resolved, because the noise was so great from the audience, that the dancers couldn't count their way through what was an incredibly complex metrical scheme. And so Nijinsky started screaming what he thought the right metrical scheme was, having climbed on a chair, while Stravinsky held on to his dressing gown and pulled him back from his attempts to jump on. So it was all mayhem. I think it would be, no doubt, madly damaging, no doubt madly upsetting for Stravinsky, and it's hard to estimate how painful something like that would be. But I think he also had a fairly sure sense that he'd written something quite extraordinary, which he had. What was regrettable was that he initially sort of backed up his collaborators, but then as time went on, turned on them and was incredibly rude about Nijinsky and Diaghilev and Roerich quite soon after. And that's a sort of shame when people who've worked together or shared the same struggles turn on each other. And he did that a little bit ungenerously.
Did Diaghilev care what the critics were going to say? Was the thought that it had gone exactly as I'd hoped, and he knew that the critics wouldn't be kind, but that was also collateral damage?
Yeah, it was noise. I mean, good for him in the sense that he wasn't too wounded by whether it was positive or negative. He just loved noise. And I think he had a fairly sure sense that the radical mob and the bohemian mob and the artistic mob who were there were in praise of it and thought it was great. So he had that as a bulwark. But what mattered most was effect, and the effect was extraordinary. And, there's a certain sort of work of art. I mean, we spoke about it with Salon de Refusé, and same with Ubu, and the same with punk rock, and the same with Hurricane, the same with whatever, where actually the weight of disapproval in some peculiar way sort of flips itself backwards and suddenly becomes a noise that has its own credit within it.
One of the reasons this night is so totemic is the date, and this is with hindsight, because we're in the summer of 1913. The next summer is going to be the summer of 1914, and that's going to be the last summer of its kind ever on all sorts of different measures of history. And so this event is sometimes seen as prophetic. It's foreshadowing something, some great break. the violence, the suppressed violence in the audience, but also the kind of violence of the production itself, the challenge that it posed, the way in which it was taking no prisoners, is all a harbinger of some great fissure in civilization. Do you think that's overblown? When people see this the year before the outbreak of the war that changed everything, really did change everything, that it was a little hint of what was to come?
No, I don't think it's overblown at all. I mean, I think it was a big canary in the mine. And, it's part of what art is supposed to do and what art can do very successfully. And I think that just recently, the number of artworks that you could have said in some way presaged Brexit, or in some way presaged Trump, or in some way told us that the world was heading in a direction that might surprise us or might alarm some people. It still goes on, and people still miss them and don't read the runes in the way they could. I think Rite of Spring was the thumping rhythms I was talking about earlier are from a rural Russian background, but they're also the thumping noise of modernity and of a new technology and of a new machine age. And in some way they pointed the way towards the futurists that came soon after, but they were about the pace at which life was starting to go, which posed massive questions towards a culture that was in lots of ways very traditional and stuck in a sort of stasis. And it was a way of asking whether culture could shift and understand the new world. But also there was, as you say, there's a violence within it. It's spring, but it's not spring in the Western European sense of misty fogs and melting sunsets. It's spring in the Russian sense, which somebody wrote about it and said, spring happens in Russia in half an hour. The earth just cracks open and suddenly you get this great force of nature coming through. And the Rite of Spring in some way tries to exemplify that. And also to reflect a world that its understanding of the individual human through massive leaps in psychology, of the social human through leaps in sociology, is starting to reinvent what it was to be a person within society. And yet there were these massive forces of pushback against that, and of let's not listen to the noise of the new, let's be as traditional as possible, let's pretend that the world is the same as it always has been. And that's what you saw in the audience as well as in the performance of Rite of Spring, that there were these fortresses of stasis and then there were this besieging by the new. It was too much tension for it not to be a violent night.
When I think about the First World War and I think about this production, this work of art, one of the things it makes me think of is that the war itself, there was a Franco-Russian alliance. That one of the oddities of the First World War is Britain and France fought with Russia. So it wasn't a war for democracy until the Americans joined in a lot later. And it never made sense. It didn't make sense at the time. People were very, very conscious that this alliance between Britain and France and Tsarist Russia, with its kind of completely different understanding of the world, a completely different history and a different sensibility, it didn't make sense. And it didn't make sense in that war. And in the end, the war was in two phases. There was a phase when that was trying to be held together. And then there was a real revolution in Russia and the whole thing broke open. And you actually had a completely different war. I think the First World War is two wars, the one until 1917 and then the one from 17 to 18. But that first one from 1914 to 1917, which was horrific and it was the stalemate war, but it also had at its heart this thing that this Franco-Russian coming together, which in the end blew up. And something about this, where we started bringing that Russian sensibility to Paris, because that's where the event happened, Diaghilev and others understanding that it was going to cause an enormous ruction. But it feels to me a little bit emblematic of one of the things about the war that was to come that was impossible.
That there was an alliance between them.
That France, democratic France, and Tsarist Russia, autocratic, Tsarist, primitive in its way, a completely different world. They were fighting on the same side. They weren't on the same side. They were just on two fronts of the same war. But they were, in theory, that was the alliance. And the alliance broke in the same way that it broke, did break on 29th of May, 1913.
I'd never thought about it that way, but it's a brilliant point and fascinating. I think that it's very hard the way we all relate to Russia. It's a particularly explosive and difficult and sad issue now, because we're always grateful for Russian culture and we're always grateful for Russian art and grateful for Russian literature, which is just full of influences and lessons and insights and humanity that we'd all be slightly lost without. But we don't know Russia as well as we think we do. And also, we've never really got into the interior of Russia. I mean, the center of Russia was probably one of the very few places on earth that's never been colonized and that it's never been sentimentalized or turned into cultural artifacts in the way that almost everywhere else in the world has. There's something still sort of strange and mysterious about it that we try to fathom, but it is beyond us. It's amazing when you go to see a movie now these days, and we're still somehow allowed to laugh at Slavic people. You know, we're not allowed to laugh at so many different people from all across the world because of different forms of political correctness, all of which I'm in favour of. But somehow we still have license to laugh at Slavic people. And the otherness of them is retained in a world where, you know, we strain to reduce the otherness of other people or to make them more familiar in a variety of ways. But somehow with all Slavic people, with the sort of centre of Slavic culture, it retains this strange otherness. And there was a big thing about the far Rite of Spring, and part of the reaction against it was there was, within France at the time, there was all of this influence coming in from the whole of the rest of the world, from Gauguin bringing back art from Tahiti, Picasso and Matisse basing their portraits on African masks and on their newly understood angularity. And in some ways, among some people, the Ballet Russe was seen to be part of that exoticizing of French culture. And that was part of the pushback from the conservative element within France, is they were going, no, we've had enough of this stuff from elsewhere. We need to concentrate on our own culture.
Stravinsky went west and wound up in Hollywood. Diaghilev carried on looking for shock and outrage, worked with amazing artists. Nijinsky had a sad life, and he did succumb to mental illness. In some ways, the one that had the weirdest life of all was Roerich, who went to America, reinvented himself as a Russian mystic, found, as people sometimes do, that there are some wealthy Americans who will fund that kind of thing. And he became a sort of favorite of some extremely well-off people in New York. And then he became a friend of Henry Wallace. And I want to say this because we recorded a podcast for this podcast in a completely different series about historical what-ifs, which was about a day in 1944 at the Democratic Party convention when Henry Wallace very, very, very nearly became the vice presidential candidate to run with Franklin Roosevelt. And if he had, when Roosevelt died, he, not Truman, would have been president, and it would have been Henry Wallace's world. And people have argued a long time about whether that was a pivotal moment in world history. But one of the extraordinary things is that Wallace was, for a while anyway, completely under the spell of the man who designed the costumes for the Rite of Spring. And actually, in 1940, at the convention, when his letters to Roerich, which were called the Guru letters, and he talked to him in this extraordinary language, frankly, it made him sound, Wallace, completely mad. And the Republicans wanted to release these letters of the vice presidential candidate, and they had to strike a deal, which was the Democrats wouldn't let the world know that Wendell Willkie, the Republican candidate, was an adulterer, if the Republicans wouldn't let the world know that Henry Wallace was mad. And so of all of the ways that the Rite of Spring spreads out through history, that one is almost my favorite, which is, just because we did a podcast episode about it, it's that guy, the guy who put the weird hats on the heads of the dancers on 29th of May 1913, who nearly undid Franklin Roosevelt and Henry Wallace's run for president in 1940. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know what it means, but it's weird.
He sort of tumbles out of a Terry Gilliam cartoon, Roerich. I mean, he's straight out of the world of Monty Python. He was one of those sort of spade-bearded early 20th century figures who is destined to end up running a small cult halfway up the Himalayas, and in fact did. And he thought that he was, in some ways, a reincarnation of the Buddha, and relayed a series of mystic insights that he'd been granted by the universe to the world through his wife, which all said that the Buddha was about to return and was, unsurprisingly, going to look very like Nicholas Roerich. It's just remarkable, remarkable.
And Wallace, when Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture, he sent him on a mission across Soviet Union and Central Asia to find what he'd been promised he could find, which was drought-resistant grain. And this 2-year mission in the middle of the 1930s was a sort of international disaster zone. I mean, sending this man as a representative of the United States government through the Soviet Union to find this kind of holy grail of agriculture. The State Department had to intervene and pull him out because it looked like he might start a war.
It's fantastic. There's this funny commune called Talashkino, where Stravinsky and Roerich hung out together. And it was a place where people went to dress up in traditional medieval Russian gear, to drink from tankards, to swing axes around, probably to say fairly unspeakable things about the rest of the world and about women and about anything that wasn't who they were. But again, it's a sort of place of extreme folk belief about what Russia is and understanding of what Russia is, the like of which we don't really comprehend at all. And that was the soil from which he emerged. You imagine that they probably said thee and thou a lot, or the Russian equivalent, and laughed heartily at not very good jokes. And it sort of appeared to be like in an old TV production of Robin Hood or something.
And from that, you get terrible politics and great art.
From that, you get terrible politics and great art, indeed.
If you've enjoyed our series with Dominic about these revolutionary events in theatre, in art, you will really enjoy his book, which he published a couple of years ago. It's called Astonish Me, named after that catchphrase of Diaghilev, and it's about a whole range of revolutionary, explosive events in the art world, not all of them set in Paris. You can read about the Sex Pistols in Manchester in 1976. Get it wherever you get your books, ideally from an actual bookshop. And if you're in Paris, get it from Shakespeare & Co. We're going to be taking a short break soon from Revolutionary Ideas, not for good. We're going to be coming back. We've got the whole of the 20th century. We've got the whole of the 21st century to come. But we're going to pause for another short series that we'll tell you about shortly. Before that, we have a bonus episode coming out this weekend in which I'm going to be talking about Marinetti's The Futurist Manifesto that we mentioned in the episode on Ubu, a really remarkable document. Next time in our regular slot, we're putting out the second of the 2 recent live episodes of PPF that we recorded in front of an audience. This one happened at the Bath Curious Minds Festival. It's not about a revolutionary as such. It's about a man sometimes people consider a counter-revolutionary, though he wasn't that either. It's a conversation with Robert Saunders about the politician whose life in politics probably encompassed more and more twists and turns than any other. It's Winston Churchill. This is a year of many Churchill anniversaries. A lot of the important things that happened in his life happened in a year that ends with a 5, 60 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, 110 years ago. We're going to try and encompass all of that in this conversation. It's called Churchill, the Politician with 9 Lives. That one is in our regular slot on Sunday. Do join us for all that. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.